Marcus and Elena inherited a remote property in the Copper Canyon region of Chihuahua from their great-uncle, a man they barely knew. Among his scattered documents and old journals was a hand-drawn map, yellowed and fragile, marked with cryptic symbols and a single phrase in Spanish, Las casas en la piedra, the houses in the stone. Local ranchers had always spoken of strange cliff formations along the canyon's eastern wall, but no one had ever ventured there. The terrain was treacherous, and the canyon itself seemed to swallow sound. When Marcus and Elena discovered photographs in their uncle's collection showing what appeared to be rectangular openings carved directly into rock faces, they knew they couldn't ignore it. What had their great-uncle found, and why had he kept it hidden for so long? The decision came quickly. Elena, a technical climber, and Marcus, an amateur historian, began researching the canyon's geology and pre-Columbian settlement patterns. They found references to the Tarahumara people and earlier Mogollon cultures that had inhabited the region centuries ago, but nothing specific about cliff dwellings in this particular location. The more they searched, the more they realized they were chasing something their uncle had discovered alone, something that had consumed his final years. By late autumn, they had assembled climbing gear, hired a local guide who knew the canyon, and committed to a descent that would take them into territory few had explored. The morning they arrived at the cliff edge, fog clung to the canyon floor far below. The rock face stretched vertically for over 300 meters, its surface scarred by wind and time. Elena fastened her harness and checked the anchors twice. Marcus loaded the camera equipment and secured the rope. Their guide, an older man named Javier who had known their great-uncle decades ago, stood silently watching. He had warned them about the canyon's mood, how weather could trap them, how the rock could become unstable after heavy rains. But he had also confirmed something crucial. He had seen the openings in the cliff face once, years ago, and they were no natural formation. Chapter 1. Into the canyon. The descent began at dawn, with the canyon walls still wrapped in shadow. Elena moved first, rappelling smoothly along the fixed rope, her boots finding purchase on a surface that seemed impossibly narrow. The air grew colder as she descended, and the sound of wind echoing through the canyon intensified. Below her, the void seemed infinite. Marcus followed, moving slower, more deliberately, one hand gripping the rope while the other steadied him against the rock face. The stone was cold and rough, pitted with small holes where water had carved through for millennia. After 30 minutes of descent, Elena's voice crackled through the radio. She had reached a ledge. Marcus pushed himself lower, the rocks turning from rust-colored to deep gray as they descended deeper into shadow. The walls around them began to narrow and the air shifted. There was moisture here, and something else. A smell like earth and time, like a place that had been closed off for centuries. The ledge where Elena stood was wider than it appeared from above, perhaps 2 meters deep and 5 meters across. Her headlamp cut through the gloom, illuminating something that made her breath catch. Set into the rock face about 1 meter high and equally wide was a perfectly rectangular opening. The edges were too clean, too deliberate to be anything but human-made. Around the opening, barely visible beneath centuries of weathering and lichen, were markings. Not random scratches but deliberate patterns, geometric symbols that seemed to speak a language nobody here understood. Marcus dropped the last few meters and stepped onto the ledge. He didn't speak, just pointed his light at the opening. They stood in silence, feeling the weight of time pressing down on them. Javier had remained above, maintaining the rope, but his voice came through the radio, urgent and tense. He could see the ledge now. He could see the opening. He told them it was exactly as he remembered. Elena moved forward first, her climber's caution warring with archaeological curiosity. The opening was narrow, and the interior was completely dark. She aimed her headlamp inside and gasped. Beyond the entrance, the space opened into something larger. She could make out the outline of walls, and on those walls, marked and shadowed by her lamplight, were shapes. Hundreds of them. Spirals, handprints, animal figures, and symbols that covered nearly every surface of rock visible to her. These were petroglyphs, ancient and undisturbed, preserved by the cliff's protection from weather, and until now, human contact. Marcus was beside her now, his camera already recording. The implications were staggering. This wasn't just a shelter carved into rock. This was a dwelling, a home where someone had lived and created art that had survived centuries. The petroglyphs weren't just decoration. They told stories. They marked calendars. They recorded hunts and ceremonies and the spiritual life of the people who had made them. But as Elena stepped deeper into the chamber, her foot struck something on the floor. It was ceramic, ancient pottery, scattered as if abandoned in haste. And there, near the far wall, partially buried in dust and debris, was something that made Marcus's hands tremble. It was a jar, sealed, with markings on its exterior that matched the symbols on the walls. Whatever their great-uncle had discovered, it was still here, waiting, exactly as he had found it all those years ago. The canyon suddenly seemed very small, and very, very far from the world above. Chapter 2. The Sealed Chambers. Elena and Marcus photographed everything, careful not to disturb the artifacts more than necessary. The pottery scattered across the chamber floor was clearly intentional, broken pieces of vessels that had held water, grain, or food. The deliberate nature of the arrangement suggested a hasty evacuation, as if the inhabitants had departed suddenly and never returned. This was not a tomb. This was a home frozen in time. The sealed jar near the back wall became their focus. Marcus carefully lifted it, feeling the weight of centuries balanced in his hands. The clay was surprisingly intact, hardened by time and protected by the dry canyon air. Symbols covered its surface, geometric patterns that repeated in rhythmic sequences. Elena sketched them quickly in her notebook, comparing them to the photographs she'd taken of the wall petroglyphs. Some matched, others were different, possibly representing a kind of written language or record-keeping system nobody had documented before. The chamber itself was roughly oval, perhaps 4 meters wide and 3 meters deep. The walls were smoothed deliberately, worked by human hands with tools of stone or bone. The petroglyph panels dominated the interior, spirals that seemed to track celestial movements, animal figures that might represent totems or hunted prey, and dozens of human handprints, small and large, as if family members had pressed their palms against the stone to leave their mark to say, "We were here." But there was something else. As Elena's lamp traced across the far wall, she noticed a secondary opening, smaller than the entrance, barely visible beneath accumulated dust and fallen rock. It led deeper into the mountain. Marcus noticed her stare and followed her gaze. The implications were immediate. This chamber was not the end of the dwelling. It was an entrance to something larger, something that extended deeper into the cliff face. The radio crackled with Javier's voice from above. Clouds were moving in from the northwest. Weather was coming. They had perhaps 4 hours before conditions deteriorated to the point where descent or ascent would become too dangerous. Marcus and Elena exchanged glances. They had so many questions and so little time. Elena moved toward the secondary opening, but Marcus held her back. His instinct, and the careful historian in him, warned against rushing forward. They photographed the secondary opening extensively, noting its position and size. They documented the sealed jar and the pottery fragments. They recorded audio descriptions of what they were seeing, storing the data in waterproof cases. Their great-uncle hadn't left them answers. He had left them this location, and in leaving it, he had left them a choice: rush forward into the unknown, or step back and plan a proper expedition. The choice was taken from them when the first rope signal came through. Javier's voice was sharp now, the friendly welcome of the morning gone. The wind had shifted. Rain was visible in the distance, approaching rapidly. They had 30 minutes, perhaps less, to secure the chamber and ascend. Marcus looked at the sealed jar in his hands, then at Elena. Neither wanted to leave. Neither was willing to stay. They made a decision that would haunt them for the next 3 days. They placed the sealed jar carefully back where they had found it, covered it with a cloth to protect it from dust and debris, and used their climbing equipment to mark the chamber entrance with a subtle but durable marker, one that could be found again, but wouldn't be obvious to a casual observer. If someone had been watching them, waiting for the right moment to claim the discovery, they would have just announced it. They didn't see the figure that had been watching from the ridge above since dawn, or notice how that figure lowered a camera of his own and reached for his satellite phone. Chapter 3. The Message from Above. The ascent was harder than the descent. The wind had picked up and rain had begun to fall, making the rocks slick and dangerous. Elena climbed first, moving with controlled precision, each movement deliberate. Marcus followed, climbing faster than was wise, driven by the realization that something had shifted. Their great-uncle's secret, hidden for decades, was no longer theirs alone. They reached the top, just as the storm broke, rain driving horizontally across the canyon ridge. Javier helped pull them over the final meters, his aged hands surprisingly strong. But before Elena could catch her breath, Javier's expression told her something was wrong. Behind them, emerging from the rain and mist, was another truck. Two men wearing outdoor gear that looked expensive and unused stepped out. One held a camera. The other carried a phone and smiled in a way that suggested he had been waiting for this moment for a very long time. The man with the phone introduced himself as Alejandro Cortez, a collector of pre-Columbian artifacts. He had been tracking their great-uncle's research for years. He had resources and connections, museums, universities, wealthy private collectors who would pay extraordinary sums for artifacts like the ones that clearly lay in that chamber below. He had also filed claims on the land, claims that predated Marcus and Elena's inheritance by a matter of weeks. It was, he suggested, a complex legal situation. Marcus felt his heart sink. Their great-uncle hadn't been alone in his discovery. He had simply kept it secret, kept it safe, until he could pass it to family who might understand its importance. Now that secret was exposed, and they stood in the rain facing a man with resources, connections, and apparently legal claim to the property. Cortez offered a compromise. He would share the discovery, credit their family as co-discoverers, and together they would bring the site to the attention of academic institutions and Mexican authorities. It would be done properly, he promised. It would be done with respect. The only alternative, he suggested, was a lengthy legal battle that would delay the excavation by years and ultimately result in the site being secured by the government, with Cortez's lawyers ensuring that Marcus and Elena received proper credit and compensation. The rain intensified. Elena looked at Marcus, and Marcus looked at Javier. The old man's face was unreadable, but his jaw was set in a way that suggested he had seen this before. Greed overriding honor, impatience overriding preservation. Yet he said nothing. This was their decision to make. Marcus thought of the sealed jar, of the petroglyphs, of their great-uncle's decades of solitary study. He thought of chambers that had been undisturbed for centuries, waiting. He thought of answers that might yet be found in that second opening, that deeper passage into the mountain. If you're enjoying this adventure so far, tell us in the comments where in the world you're watching from. Chapter 4. The Return. The legal battle came anyway, though not in the way Cortez had promised. Within 2 weeks, 3 separate entities had filed claims on the land. Cortez's holding company, a Mexican federal agency claiming pre-Columbian sites fell under national protection laws, and an international archaeology consortium based in Mexico City. The delays stretched from weeks into months. Marcus and Elena, frustrated but determined, retained a lawyer who specialized in heritage law. Javier returned to his ranch and his silence, though he visited them in the city several times, bringing documents from their great-uncle's collection that nobody had found in the initial search. Old photographs, sketches, notes in Spanish describing what he had discovered and, more importantly, why he had chosen not to excavate. The great-uncle's journals revealed a man caught between his desire for knowledge and his respect for the past. He had found the chamber accidentally, descending into the canyon after a landslide had briefly exposed the entrance. He had documented the petroglyphs, cataloged the artifacts, and then sealed everything exactly as he had found it. His notation was clear. Some discoveries are meant to be shared with those who understand their value beyond profit or academic credential. Some sites deserve to rest in peace until the right hands are ready to receive them. By spring, the legal complexity resolved itself through a combination of factors. The Mexican government took official custody of the site, but granted Marcus and Elena formal status as co-discoverers and authorized them to participate in any official excavation. Cortez's claims were dismissed when his documentation proved fraudulent. The international consortium was reformed into an advisory body with no claim to ownership. In May, permission for excavation was finally granted. Marcus and Elena, along with Elena's climbing team and a small archaeological crew vetted by the government, made the descent again. This time, in daylight and clear weather, the chamber seemed almost welcoming. The sealed jar was still there untouched. The petroglyphs seemed to glow in the natural light that now reached them for the first time in centuries. But their focus was on that secondary opening. That smaller passage, barely visible beneath accumulated stone and earth. It took 2 days of careful excavation to clear it enough for passage. When Elena finally squeezed through, her headlamp illuminating the space beyond, she fell silent for so long that Marcus called her name, terrified something had happened. "There are more chambers," she finally said, her voice filled with wonder. "Multiple chambers connected, stretching deeper into the mountain than we ever imagined. And Marcus, there are more petroglyphs, thousands of them. It's like an entire library carved into stone." The sealed jar, when finally opened under proper archaeological supervision, contained documents. Not written text, but pressed plant fibers bearing pigment marks that appeared to be a form of symbolic notation. Alongside them were small carved figures, tools, and what appeared to be astronomical calculations marked on stone. It would take years to fully document and understand what they had found. But one thing was immediately clear. Their great-uncle hadn't just discovered a dwelling. He had found evidence of a sophisticated pre-Columbian culture that had developed complex record-keeping systems, maintained detailed astronomical knowledge, and created art that rivaled any known from the region, and he had chosen to protect it, waiting for the right moment and the right people to reveal it to the world. Chapter 5. The Deeper Mystery. As the excavation progressed through the summer, more chambers were revealed, each one connected to the last through narrow passages that seemed designed to be hidden from casual exploration. The archaeological team worked methodically, documenting everything, preserving the petroglyphs with molds and photography and carefully cataloging every artifact. But what emerged was a mystery within the mystery. The petroglyphs told a story, one that archaeologists were only beginning to decipher. They suggested a culture that had studied the movement of stars and planets with remarkable accuracy. They documented hunts and ceremonies, yes, but also migrations, encounters with other peoples, and what appeared to be records of natural disasters, earthquakes and floods marked in the stone, dated through careful analysis of the symbols' placement and style. Then there were the symbols that didn't match any known pre-Columbian writing system. Elena spent hours photographing them, comparing them with academic databases, consulting with linguists and anthropologists. Some appeared to be astronomical, marking positions of celestial bodies at specific times. Others seemed to be numerical, or possibly genealogical, tracking lineages or population records. Marcus discovered something that stopped everyone. In the deepest chamber, behind a deliberately constructed wall of stacked stones, was a second sealed chamber. This one was much smaller, perhaps only a meter wide, but the care taken to seal and hide it was extraordinary. When it was finally opened, it contained a single artifact. A stone tablet, roughly circular, covered entirely in carved symbols. The tablet was distinct from everything else found in the site. The stone was different, quarried from somewhere else, transported deliberately to this location. The tablet's purpose became their obsession. Elena hypothesized it was a calendar, but the symbols didn't align neatly with known Mesoamerican calendar systems. Marcus suggested it might be a key, a legend that could unlock the meaning of all the other petroglyphs. The archaeological team examined it under specialized lighting, made high-resolution scans, and consulted with experts across Mexico and the United States. What emerged was tantalizing and frustrating in equal measure. The tablet appeared to be a record, perhaps documentation of astronomical events, or calendrical notations, or something more esoteric. But without a linguistic key, without understanding the cultural context in which it had been created, they could not definitively interpret it. What they could determine was that it dated from approximately 800 CE, roughly aligned with the peak of Mogollon culture in the region, but distinct enough to suggest this particular community had developed its own symbolic language. Javier, visiting the site in July, stood before the tablet for a long time without speaking. When he finally turned to Marcus and Elena, there was something knowing in his expression. He told them their great-uncle had spent his final years trying to solve this exact puzzle. He had filled notebooks with sketches and theories, had traveled to libraries and museums, had consulted with academics in secret. He had never shared his research because he believed, or perhaps feared, that once the solution was known, the site would be overrun with treasure seekers and academics, and the peace that had protected these chambers for centuries would be shattered. If this treasure hunt already has you hooked, hit the like button. It helps us bring more forgotten stories to light. Chapter 6. The Legacy. By August, as the season turned and the canyon's weather became increasingly volatile, the initial excavation phase came to an end. The chambers had been thoroughly documented, the artifacts carefully removed for conservation and study, and the petroglyphs recorded through advanced photogrammetry that created three-dimensional digital maps of every carved surface. The site itself was sealed against future looting, with only a narrow access passage maintained for future researchers. Mexican authorities established it as a protected archaeological site, with UNESCO considering it for World Heritage designation. The international attention was significant, but nothing like the frenzy Cortez had anticipated or that the great-uncle had feared. Marcus and Elena published their findings in collaboration with academic institutions, ensuring proper credit for the discovery and for the indigenous communities whose ancestors had created these chambers. The sealed jar and its contents became central to a new research initiative investigating pre-Columbian communication systems. The mysterious tablet sparked decades of linguistic and archaeological inquiry. But the deepest discovery, for Marcus and Elena, was understanding their great-uncle's choice. He hadn't kept the site secret out of greed or possessiveness. He had kept it secret out of respect. Respect for the ancient peoples whose voices echoed in those stone chambers. Respect for the need for proper knowledge and understanding before exposure. And respect for the possibility that some discoveries carry more weight when they are approached with patience and reverence rather than haste and ambition. The sealed jar that had begun as a mystery became a bridge connecting centuries. The petroglyphs, no longer hidden, sang their stories not to collectors or fortune seekers, but to students and scholars and to anyone who believed that understanding the past enriches the present. The chambers in the cliff face remained partly enigmatic, their deepest secrets still waiting, still preserved, still teaching. On their final visit to the site that autumn, Elena and Marcus stood where they had first descended, where the ropes had carried them down into the unknown. The canyon stretched below them, beautiful and formidable, exactly as it had been for centuries. But now they knew what lay within those cliffs. Not treasure, though gold and precious objects had been found. Something more enduring. A record. A legacy. The voice of a people saying across nearly 12 centuries, "We were here. We thought. We created. We endured." That was the true treasure, and their great-uncle had understood it all along. Subscribe to our channel for more incredible tales of discovery and hidden history. See you in the next adventure.